Hey Bethlehem, this is Pastor Paul, and this past Sunday we started a new sermon series through the book of Galatians called Living in Grace. Now, when we come to the book of Galatians, which is one of the letters written by the Apostle Paul, we see that it is about the difference between living in grace and living by the law. And that kind of brings up this question of what is the law? What's the purpose of the law? And in some ways, that is the theme of the book. What purpose does the law serve in the life of people? And as Christians, we kind of have this weird relationship with the law because on the one hand, we understand that it's important because we'll say things like, hey, it is the 10 commandments, not the 10 suggestions. Yet on the other hand, we don't follow all the law. When was the last time you honored the Sabbath day and you kept it holy? The Sabbath day being sundown Friday night to sundown Saturday night. And so we're in this weird relationship with the law. So what purpose does it have? Now, I believe that the letter to the Galatians is one of the first, if not the very first letter that Paul writes. And he writes it after his first missionary journey. And he comes back to the city of Antioch in Syria. That church there had sent Paul and Barnabas out to take the gospel into the world. And he gets back and he hears these reports of the people that Paul had worked with and brought into God's kingdom. They were turning away and following a different gospel. They were doing something else. And so Paul writes this letter to them. And on Sunday, we just looked at the first 5 verses or the introduction to this letter. And I think even though it's just the introduction, there are 3 different parts of Paul's ministry that we discover in it. And these parts of Paul's ministry really also apply to the ministry that we are to have. And so first of all, Paul focuses on his calling. See, he says that, yeah, I may have been sent by this church, but my calling, my true sending comes from Jesus and by God the Father. He wants them to understand that what message he gave them, the gospel that he proclaimed to them, had its roots not in human origins, but in God. God was the one that called him. And we too have been called by God. When we are brought into God's kingdom, when we accept Jesus and we experience salvation, we have this calling. And Paul in 2 Corinthians says that we are God's ambassadors. We are God's representatives. That's the call that we have. And everywhere we go, we are to represent Jesus. To our families, to our children, to our co-workers, we represent Jesus. The second part of Paul's ministry that we see here is that he focuses on his message. And the message that he has is this message that God has rescued us out of this evil world. That through Jesus' death and resurrection, we have been rescued from this world. And that's the message he proclaims. And not just for the Jews, but for the Gentiles. God rescues us out of the evil, this corruption that we find in God's good creation. The world was created to be good. Now it's evil. And we have things like war and famine and poverty and disease and abuse and all those things. That is here. That corrupts God's good creation. That makes it evil. But not only that, it's evil because of people's actions. And we experience evil often through the actions of other people. And so we bring this message of hope that God is rescuing us out. And one of the ways that we bring this message of hope isn't just through the sharing of the gospel, through the message that we have, but it's living out this message. And so often when we look at the world around us, we see that Christians have not only proclaimed the gospel, but they lived the gospel. And so in our history, we see that our universities were often started by Christian people. They were started as Christian universities. Our hospitals were started as Christian hospitals because Christians were out there saying, no, we bring the gospel too through these acts of service by pushing back against the evil of this world. And then the third part of Paul's ministry is seen in his desire to give God glory and honor. And that's the motivating factor for us too, is that we want God to have the glory. We want God to be worshiped. We want God to be praised. And by doing that, we do that by, as we've been talking about, by demonstrating God's character. And so our big idea, the bottom line from Sunday is this: our calling and our salvation is for God's glory. Our calling and our salvation is all for God's glory. That is what we want. And so our challenge this week is this: write out your understanding of the gospel. What is the gospel? And then think about how you would share that message with somebody else. Now, throughout this sermon series, kind of the big idea, the bottom line of this sermon series is this, is that that Christians are people of grace. And therefore we need to live that grace out. We need to be a blessing to those around us. God's blessed us to be a blessing. Now, I hope that you have a wonderful week. We'll see you on Sunday. God bless.